Welcome to the very first of my lectures on American intellectual traditions, covering especially pragmatism and behaviorism. This lecture will be part of a series on behaviorism and mind. Other series will cover ethics, truth, free will, and similar kinds of topics. Hopefully, quality will improve over time with tweaking, feedback, and so on. But without further ado, let's get started. So for today's lecture, there's a few readings you could look at if you want to follow along more carefully. We'll be talking about three different people, so I suggest three different essays by each of them. You can find references to these in the lecture notes. So the first, Edgar A. Singer Jr., his essay, Mind as an Observable Object. The second would be Grace Andres de Laguna's essay, Emotion and Perception from the Behaviorist Standpoint. And the last person we'll talk about is Yervant H. Krikorian, A Naturalistic View of Mind. So these are the three people that we'll be looking at in this lecture that I'll talk about. And those are three worthwhile essays of theirs. First, let me introduce generally, since this is the first lecture on this topic, let me give a kind of general introduction to the topic of behaviorism and mind. So, mind. Is the mind a mystery? Is consciousness a problem of such depth and far-reaching complexity as to be fathomless to consciousness itself? Or is consciousness or experience or thought, these are related words, are they something more mundane, something the brain performs in much the same way that the stomach performs digestion or the liver secretes bile? I think the way you prefer to answer these questions will tell us more about your personality than anything else. So William James famously divided philosophers into tender-minded and tough-minded. It's a very well-known distinction. Some people, the tender-minded ones, love mystery. They love a good mystery. They love wonder. Others, the tough-minded, just want facts, just want the facts, as the old detectives used to say. Sometimes I like to classify philosophers in another way. It's either inflationary or deflationary. So some philosophers like to inflate the things they study with mystery. They like some things to be beyond mere human comprehension. We're going to talk a lot about consciousness in these lectures, and Daniel Dennett, the typical deflationary philosopher, he's put it well that for some people, consciousness is magic or it is nothing at all. So if consciousness is not mysterious, it's not consciousness. On the other hand, you have deflationists, deflationary people like Dennett, like to poke holes in these mysteries, bring them back down to earth. They get off on showing how the magic trick is done. To reach for relatively contemporary examples of each of these positions, you have the tender-minded inflationist Colin McGinn, one of the so-called new Mysterians, who doesn't think we'll ever solve the problem of consciousness, thinks it's beyond our cognitive abilities. On the other hand, there's the tough-minded deflationist, John Searle, who's one in a long line of philosophers to make the digestion analogy or make analogies to other parts of the body, other organs. If it's not clear already, it will become clear that I relate more to this second group of philosophers, which does strike me as particularly American, though it has parallels in other parts of the world, especially Britain. In this series of lectures on American behaviorism and the philosophy of mind, we're going to look at some older thinkers in the tough-minded or deflationary tradition. They go by various names, so pragmatists, new empiricists, experimentalists, or just behaviorists, but they all take a deflationary or very down-to-earth approach to the mind, for the most part. So although they don't always use this name, I tend to think of all the people I'll be talking about as behaviorists. So if there's a proposition that unites them, it's that mind or consciousness, and we'll get into different definitions later, is a form of behavior and can be investigated as such. So they tend to have a more specialized definition of consciousness than non behaviorists. Behaviorism has a bit of a bad reputation these days. So the Canadian philosopher William Seeger, written a lot about consciousness, he sums up the prevailing view when he writes that in the 20th century, a soulless behaviorism arose, which at best ignored the mind and at worst denied its very existence. I don't know exactly who Seeger has in mind, probably people like B.F. Skinner, but actually, there were a few schools of thought that got labeled or labeled themselves as behaviorism in the 20th century. Some so called behaviorists did ignore the mind. It's debatable whether any notable behaviorists actually denied its very existence, as Seeger said. This is a bit of a stereotype. It's hard to, I haven't found a really strong reality behind that. But nevertheless, so if I say, when I say behaviorism, many people are going to think, first of all, B.F. Skinner, right? One of the most famous psychologists of the 20th century, one of the founders of modern behaviorism. But as we'll see in a later lecture, Skinner actually wrote quite a lot about the mind. The problem that some people have with behaviorism stems from, I think, personality differences that I talked about before, more than anything else, really. In the eyes of many philosophers, behaviorists, and other empiricists, pragmatists, people like that, they don't treat the mind with the proper degree of reverence. They don't think it's mysterious enough. But on the other hand, this might be something attractive about them, depending on what kinds of things you like, depending on your personality, how you view things. But even if you don't think this is a attractive way to look at this, even if you're the kind of person who wants things to be mysterious, I think it's well worth considering what the American behaviorist tradition has had to say about the mind. So, and it should be remembered that the whole reason behaviorism started, going back to the early 20th century, was that theories of consciousness by the late 19th century had become so exotic and unprovable that it was hard to figure out how they could be of any use to us. Behaviorists suggested that maybe we were working from bad premises. Maybe we should go back to the beginning and start from something more concrete, such as behavior. Now, we've been experiencing a renaissance of consciousness study since about the 1980s, maybe a bit earlier. But again, some of these new theories have become so complex, so exotic, that I wonder if, again, we've been asking the wrong questions, going about things in the wrong way. So I think the old behaviorists still have a bit to teach us, even if you don't completely agree with them. For example, people, including philosophers, often talk about the mind as if it's a thing that has certain properties, or as if it's a place where something happens. But if you frame mind in this way, you're bound to be frustrated, or you're bound to make a mystery for yourself, because you're not likely to find the mind. You can look all around my head, you can open up my body and look inside, but so far no one has found a mind this way. So what is the mind? Behaviorists, of course, are going to argue that the mind is behavior, basically, or certain kinds of behaviors or procedures or operations performed by the body in relation to its environment. The problem is that a significant portion of my so-called mental behavior isn't visible to anyone else, right? This curious feature makes mind hard to understand. But this is not because mind is essentially mysterious, but rather it's because it's just hard to find good analogies. And understanding is, at its basic essence, comparing something less familiar to something more familiar. A decent but not perfect analogy is maybe computer software. So a computer program, as you use it, is not really a thing. The program itself is not really a thing. It's the outcome of a machine following certain instructions. The person interacting with the program sees only a small part of what the machine is doing. You see words, pictures, colored shapes, and so on. This is, we might call it the overt behavior of the program, like the gestures and noises that we make with our bodies. But there are also all sorts of other operations going on inside the computer that we can't see, which result from other sets of instructions. We can call this the program's covert behavior. These are common terms in behaviorism: overt behavior, covert behavior. It's kind of like behavior you can see, behavior that is hidden or that you can't normally see. Although we can't normally see this behavior going on inside the machine, if the overt behavior, the images and the sounds and so on, is occurring in the expected way, we can be sure that certain covert behavior, certain background operations are also taking place. But we can't also, by the way, nor can we, by the way, experience what it's like for the machine to perform these software operations. So like we cannot have the same subjective experience as another person, we can't experience what it's like for the machine. But there is still a lot we can find out about the machine and its mind software by careful investigation. We can figure out what relationship there is, if any, between the physical machinery and the software code and the visible output. This is only a loose analogy, of course, and philosophers will look at in these early lectures lived before very much was known about digital computers. They had been kind of invented, but they were not common, so you won't find a lot of computer analogies. Nevertheless, this makes the idea of mind as behavior a bit less strange. All right, so let's move on to the Singerian tradition, which I have named after Edgar Singer, who I'll talk about. So in this first lecture, we're going to look at some writings from what I call the Singerian tradition. Edgar Singer, a philosopher from the early 20th century, has some claim to be called the first behaviorist, though he did not apply this label to himself exactly. But he was the first person, as far as I'm aware, to argue that the mind should be studied as behavior. His ideas were expanded on by two other very interesting but little known philosophers, Grace de Laguna and Yervant H. Krikorian. So I'll tell you a little bit about each of them before getting into the behaviorist theory of mind. So Edgar Singer was born in 1873, died in 1954, which makes him about a generation younger than the classical pragmatists, such as Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, John Dewey, George Herbert Mead. So like William James, Singer was as much in the world of psychology as philosophy. He did his dissertation under the psychologist George S. Fullerton, and was then an assistant to William James in psychological research. Singer's dissertation, incidentally, was called on the composite nature of consciousness, and may have had some influence on William James, actually. Singer spent most of his career at the University of Pennsylvania. Most of the people I'll talk about were Northeasterners or lived in the Northeast for a lot of their lives. He had a number of important students. Probably his most influential disciples were a couple of guys named C. West Churchman and Russell Ackoff, who together developed systems theory and operations research. They attribute a lot of systems research ideas to Edgar Singer, so he had influence in some different areas. Singer published several books, which are hard to find, unfortunately, although a few of them you can get online. His books cover topics such as history of philosophy, philosophy of science, ethics. In 1910, he delivered a paper to the American Philosophical Association titled Mind as an Observable Object. This was published the next year in the Journal of Philosophy, Psychology, and Scientific Methods, and it was later collected in Singer's book, Mind as Behavior. And you can, this is an older book, so you can find it to download online if you're interested. This paper, Mind as an Observable Object, is one place you might mark as the beginning of behaviorism. A few years after this, in 1913, John B. Watson would publish his so-called Behaviorist Manifesto, in which he declared that the concept of consciousness had become unusable. And so psychologists should focus on observable behaviors for the time being. This is not Singer's position, however. Rather, he is going to argue that if we want to say anything meaningful about it, we need to treat mind or consciousness as a kind of observable behavior. So Singer's not banning consciousness, as behaviorists are sometimes accused of doing. He's trying to formulate the problem of consciousnness in such a way that we can investigate it using the tools of science. So that's Singer. Grace Mead Andres de Laguna, the second person I'll talk about, born in 1878, so just a few years younger than Edgar Singer. She died 1978, so she had a long life. She got her BA and PhD at Cornell University. In 1905, she married another philosopher, Theodore de Laguna, and I'll discuss his work when I get to my series of lectures on ethics, probably. He's also an interesting guy. But early on, Grace and Theodore wrote a book together called Dogmatism and Evolution, which basically compares pre-Darwinian and post-Darwinian philosophy. Both Theodore and Grace saw themselves as post-Darwinian or evolutionary philosophers. I'll also point out that Theodore and Grace's daughter, Frederica, was a very important anthropologist working mainly among Native Americans. Actually, she's probably better known than her parents, and she also seems to have had a very interesting life. Apparently, Grace would also sometimes accompany Frederica on expeditions. Grace and Theodore's son, Wallace, as far as I can figure out, was some kind of nuclear scientist. So, anyway, it was a smart family, obviously. In addition to various essays about mind, which I'll touch on in today's lecture, and you can find in the references to this lecture, Grace de Laguna published a book about language called Speech, Its Function and Development. Although it was published back in 1927, it still is one of the best books on language from an evolutionary and behaviorist perspective. And it's in this book that she acknowledges her debt to Singer. This book in turn had a big influence on Morse Peckham, another intellectual who I'll discuss in later lectures. And then lastly, Yervant Krikorian, or Y.H. Krikorian, you sometimes see his name as. He was born in 1892, died 1977, so about a generation younger than Singer and also de Laguna. Krikorian was an Armenian originally, emigrated to the United States in his 20s to escape the Armenian genocide. In many ways, he seems to have been a disciple of Singer, not in the literal sense. I don't think he was ever actually a student of Singer's, but his philosophy does follow Singer's very closely, sometimes even plagiaristically. And he's useful for us here because he rephrases and expands on Singer's ideas and synthesizes them with those of others. All right, so now let's move a little bit into some of the concepts for this lecture. So let's talk about empiricism first. So Singer called himself empiricist of some sort. He had different words for this, but as behaviorists, the Singerians, so Singer, de Laguna, Krikorian, were empiricists. They were also empiricists. But at the same time, they were also arguing against or trying to correct the modern form of empiricism, particularly British empiricism that they took from Descartes, or that the British empiricism that took off or developed out of Descartes. The important thing about Descartes in this context, of course, is his theory of mind. So, first of all, Descartes was what's called a substance dualist, meaning that he thought mind and body were separate kinds of things. This idea seems commonsensical enough, and it was accepted by the British empiricists. Secondly, so Descartes was an epistemological rationalist. Descartes distrusted experience, so he thought that the truth about reality could only be known through deductive reasoning, deduction. So Descartes thought we have certain innate ideas that we can combine or analyze in various ways to gain knowledge about the world. And it's only through these ideas, such as that everything has a cause or that God exists, that we can interpret our experience. Although they tended to be substance dualists, the British empiricists rejected epistemological rationalism. They thought, instead, that our knowledge about the world comes mainly or only through experience. The external world produces sensations in our mind from which we derive or build up our ideas about the world. The order is not mind to world, but world to mind. This has a couple of strange consequences. So first, it seems that we don't know the real world directly, but only the sensations it supposedly produces in our minds. Right? We don't really know directly anything, we know our minds. Therefore, so like as with Descartes, we can't be sure that the physical, non-mental world actually exists. So maybe some evil wizard is producing the sensations in our mind that we take to be external objects. Second, we can't be sure that other minds exist either. Other people's minds can't cause sensations in our own minds, at least in substance dualism, because they have no physical properties. This is the problem of solipsism, the theory that only one's mind exists, or that you can only be sure that your own mind exists, and you don't know about other people's minds. This is the problem Singer inherits and wants to solve in terms of his own philosophy of mind. So he's going to attack this problem of solipsism by showing that the mind is embodied and social. Now, De Laguna and Krikorian are less concerned with solipsism. They're more concerned with dualism, and you could call both monists, describe them as monists. At least they're both monists in the sense that they reject the idea that mind exists in a separate realm from that of the body. Or rather, they think no evidence could be produced to prove or disprove the existence of this realm. So psychology doesn't need to bother with it. Mind, they're going to argue, is simply a function of particular kinds of organisms. Organisms being physical stuff organized in a certain way. So functions of particular kinds of organisms in particular environmental conditions. Now, words like mind and consciousness are used in different ways by different philosophers, and they're often used inconsistently and, I'd say, sloppily often. The Singerians are going to argue that mind is observable, or rather that if the word mind is to have any meaning, it must be defined in such a way as to be susceptible to experimental inquiry. Singer puts it in this way, so I'll read a little quote from Singer. He says that life and mind must be defined in terms of behavior, whether observed or expected. To assert the existence or non-existence of anything is meaningless unless we can verify the assertion. But experience is the only means of verifying assertions, and behavior the only aspect of the beings we call living or conscious, which is matter for experience. Hence, in our empirical reasons for calling one thing alive, another not, one thing conscious, another unconscious, must lie the meaning of life and mind. So, however we define mind, we need to be able to verify through experience, through prediction and observation, that such a thing exists. Otherwise, what are we talking about? So behavior or overt behavior is the only aspect of living things we can experience that would lead us to think of them as having minds, as being conscious. So there are many other aspects of living things we can observe, of course, their anatomy, their outward appearance, and so forth. But none of this will by itself tell us if the lights are on, so to speak. So what kinds of things are we looking for? Singer sometimes writes of the sensing mind and the conscious mind, and this is a good starting point. So the distinction here between sensing mind and conscious mind is, I think, what philosophers in more recent times mean when they speak of creature consciousness, as opposed to mental state consciousness. Creature consciousness is, to put it simply, sensation or perception, while mental state consciousness is something like the perception of a mental state. As Singer puts it, the sensing mind is a response to a stimulus in the environment, something out there. The conscious mind consists of mental states that are themselves responses to the stimulus of other mental states. Krikorian, however, makes some refinements to this, and I'll try to introduce some further clarity into Krikorian. His discussion gets a bit complex. So I think Krikorian would say that there is sensing on the one hand and mind on the other. So it's not necessarily advisable to use one word, like mind or consciousness, for what we'll see are very different things. And when it comes to mind, there are processes that can occur unconsciously and processes that are conscious. So then there are three aspects of an organism's internal behavior that we need to keep distinct, and which people often mix together when they start talking about mind or consciousness. So three internal behaviors. So we have sensation, as I mentioned, we have unconscious mind, and then we have conscious mind. So the broad outline of this lecture comes out of Krikorian's refinement of Singer. But however we categorize the various aspects of mind, these aspects need to be observable. So what is observable are going to be things like, does the organism's behavior show that it can discriminate colors? If it needs to press a blue button in a button reflecting light of a certain wavelength to receive something good, can it do this under various conditions? Does an organism's behavior show that it can learn? Does it show that it can remember something that happened 10 minutes ago, that happened 10 years ago, and so on? This is all evidence of what we would normally call mind, something like perception, learning, memory, but it's all publicly observable. So it's nothing hidden. It's something you can learn through experience, observe through experiment. Much of this so-called mental behavior can be studied by observing nonverbal physical behavior. With humans, of course, verbal behavior or language plays a big role. And with verbal behavior, of course, observation of introspection becomes possible. So you can ask people basically, what are you thinking? So introspection. There was much debate in the 20th century about whether introspection, so reporting one's own thoughts and feelings, is an acceptable method in psychology. So is introspection acceptable? as a method. Some behaviorists rejected introspection as valid, but the Singerian tradition accepts it. They think it's useful. It accepts it, introspection, with the proviso that introspective statements are not observations in the scientific sense, but responses. So this is, which is to say that they're to be treated as experimental data, more like the paths of celestial bodies or the dances of bees or tracks in a cloud chamber. So the experimenter can expose you to various stimuli under controlled conditions in order to elicit introspective reports. So reports about your sensations or thoughts or feelings. And the experimenter would try to systematically relate these reports with the experimental conditions. Something Grace de Laguna talks about, has an interesting discussion about. So that I cannot know your private experiences as you experience them, as opposed to how you report them, that's not really a big worry for behaviorists. As de Laguna puts it, exchanging one's experiences for another's is an activity only a god might enjoy. So it's not for mere humans to experience the world as another person. And in addition, I'll address the topic of what are called philosophical zombies, a related issue about philosophical zombies, which are regular-looking people who have no private experiences, at the end of this lecture. So I want to say just a little bit about sensation before we get on to the topics of consciousness and mind. So many philosophers consider sensation to be a part of consciousness, as you can see with a term like creature consciousness, which I mentioned earlier. Though this term sometimes runs together what I would distinguish as sensation and perception. Perception is a part of mind for De Laguna and Krikorian, but not really sensation. So philosophers also sometimes use terms like qualia or raw feels to discuss sensation. Charles Sanders Peirce used the term firstness. Yeah, his famous firstness, secondness, thirdness. Firstness is something like sensation, what other philosophers mean by sensation. So these would all be things like particular sensations of pain or taste or odor or color, in distinction from any objects or conditions that might be causing those sensations. So you perceive objects, but you sense odors, colors, tastes, textures. There's a difference between perception and sensation. Singerians believe that sensation is open to observation. So a sensation is one form of the body's response to a stimulus. And there are many tests you can run to determine, for one thing, the stimulus a person is responding to. And secondly, you can determine the type and intensity of the sensation. So you can figure out the stimulus and how you are sensing that stimulus. And doctors do this all the time when diagnosing patients. What you cannot do, of course, is experience yourself the same sensation. So there will always be an element of uncertainty. This worries some philosophers and raises the specter of solipsism. But from Singer's neo-empiricist or behaviorist or even pragmatist approach, there's nothing especially disturbing about this. We're not going to achieve certainty about anything in this world, he might say. We can learn a lot about rocks, but we'll never be able to experience existence as a rock. We cannot have the experience of a computer running software, like I mentioned before. We can't experience life with another person's nervous system. So why make this a criterion of knowledge about anything? In fact, a person having the sensation of pain doesn't directly know about this pain either, or at least the case that she does is not so simple as you might think. We don't know instants of pain in the particular instance, in the moments in which they occur. We always know them after the fact. There's a perceptual, interpretational process that occurs across time that's, by definition, always just late to the game. For De Laguna, sensation and perception, or the qualitative distinctness and the meaning of objects develop together. We can't strip away the historical and the, for humans at least, partly social element in sensation. This process of interpretation gets us closer to what Krikorian in particular means by mind. All right, so now let's move on to mind. So Krikorian, building on Singer and some others, defines mind as response to the meanings of stimuli. Response to the meanings of stimuli. So what could this mean? In behaviorism, let's begin with this. In behaviorism, the meaning of a stimuli, so something in the world that you respond to, the meaning of a stimuli is the set of responses it may evoke or call out in the organism. So the meaning is what the organism does in response to that thing. For there to be mind, in behavioristic terms, there needs to be more than one response available. Otherwise, we're simply talking about hardwired reflex, as when the doctor taps your knee and you jerk your leg. There may be some pure hardwired sensations, but these fall outside the discussion of mind. To have a mind is to have options, even if we are often guided by habit. So in fact, if someone acts in a too habitual way, we might call them mindless. Maybe you've heard that. Part of what we mean by being smart, on the other hand, is having more possible responses available to you and being able to choose the best response in a given situation. And this means anticipating, foreseeing, predicting what will be the likely consequences of a given response. So Krikorian redefines mind as the control of behavior by anticipation. The control of behavior, he says, by anticipation. This is observable, this mind in this sense is observable because, so first of all, there are experiments that you can do to figure out how much human behavior is hardwired and thus non-mental. So I don't expect we'll ever know everything there is to know about this, but we do seem to be refining our knowledge about it all the time. Second, as we'll talk about more in a later lecture, people have styles of responses, types and ranges of behavior that they exhibit in particular situations. So you can learn something about a person's mind by studying how she responds in certain situations or in a series of situations compared to other people. So it's not easy to factor in the genetic component, of course. And this is why studies of twins are important, for example. So people with the same genes can end up with different minds, we might say. And we can know this by comparing their responses, how they respond. Krikorian argues that mind, seen in this way as anticipatory response, has primarily three different dimensions. I call these the three C's, so they all start with C. Cognition, conation, and consciousness. In real life, these three dimensions, cognition, conation, consciousness, are often tangled up with each other, but they have different functions. Let's take a look at them. So this is not by any means the definitive way to look at mind, but it is, I think, a useful starting point. All right, so let's begin with cognition. So cognition for Krikorian includes things like perception, what objects are there, memory, thought. It's important to point out that all of these can occur unconsciously. I'll have more to say about that when we get to Julian Jaynes in a later lecture. But Krikorian tells us that cognition itself has three aspects. So cognition has three aspects. Cognitive response is meaningful, futuristic, and suppositional. So again, he says cognitive response is meaningful, futuristic, and suppositional. Now, I find these terms confusing. Maybe you do too. It's easier for me, even after he explains it, it's easier for me to think of the three aspects of cognition as having to do with categories, expectations, and courses of action. So you have those three aspects: categories, expectations, courses of action. So, in the first place, cognition categorizes a stimulus. So, just take a kind of a stupid example. If you're hungry and you see an apple, the meaning of the apple is that it's food, or you categorize the apple as something that can be eaten. Secondly, there's also a future-oriented aspect. You expect the apple to taste and feel a certain way, to satisfy or not satisfy your hunger, and so on. Then, given this categorial and futuristic cognitive work, expectational cognitive work, there's a third aspect. What course of action seems appropriate? Are you going to pick it up and eat it, or are you going to move on to something else? You might also see here how conative processes like purpose and desire are already tangled up with cognition. Your hunger, your desire for food, frames your cognition of the apple. And if you were a painter, say, looking for objects for a still life, the apple might have a completely different meaning for you. You're categorizing your expectations, the potential actions that you might engage with, that you would have toward it, would be quite different than if you were just a hungry person looking for food. All right, so let's move on to conation. Conation's an odd word, bit of an odd word, unusual word. Philosophers use this to talk about purposeful behavior, about things like will, about desire. In a late essay, Krikorian uses the term affective response rather than conative response, and De Laguna always uses affection rather than conation. This has maybe some drawbacks for modern readers, as the common sense of affection is a good feeling you have for someone. And some traditions of psychology actually distinguish between affection, how you feel about something, and conation, which is more like your desire for something or to do something. De Laguna and Krikorian seem to run these together, and there's some justification for this that we don't need to get in too much into the technical details right now. But Krikorian describes conation as biased anticipatory response. So you can maybe see the relation with affection in the term bias. There's a feeling you have about something. So you might, for example, anticipate some consequence of a stimulus, but you may be ready to act on that stimulus, but you may not care whether the consequence actually comes about. Conation comes into play when you do desire some particular consequence or type of consequence. So say, for example, it's another silly example, but say you're at a party and someone offers you a beer. There may be times when you are neutral about this. You might anticipate that this is the sort of thing that's going to happen, since it's the sort of thing that happens at parties. People offer you stuff. You understand cognitively the meaning of the offer, but you may have no particular bias toward accepting or rejecting it. On the other hand, I may want to get a bit drunk or very drunk. Then not only am I ready for the offer of a beer, but this offer is in alignment. It matches my conative state, my desire. Or I may be a teetotaler or a recovering alcoholic, and then I'm biased against such an offer. So conation is biased response. Krikorian's discussion of conation gets rather technical, but is the gist of it. Conation is about what you prefer, desire, hope for, and things like that. You can know about such things by studying behavior, what people do. If someone is eating a lot, you can be pretty sure they're hungry. If someone is taking aspirin, you can be pretty sure they have some minor pain they want to alleviate. And cognition in relation to conation is about anticipating the consequences of some course of action and judging the actual consequences. Is this food likely to satisfy me? Did this food satisfy me? Is this medicine likely to lessen my pain? Did it lessen my pain? There's no reason we can't get empirical knowledge about these cognitive processes as well. All right, so now on to the big one, consciousness. Let's get into this the third aspect of mind, consciousness, the third C. All behavior involves conation and cognition, according to Singerians, but it may or may not be conscious. This may sound odd, but the word consciousness has a variety of meanings, and Singerian behaviorists use it only in a limited sense. For them, consciousness is not simply experience in general or the medium of all experience or something like that. The term consciousness, as used by philosophers, is so confusing because it just has a very confusing history. In fact, Singer sketches this history in one of his essays. I'll give a bit of a summary. So, in its early history, conscious, in Latin conscius, which you can see in the works of the Roman playwright Plautus, was interpersonal or intersubjective. As an adjective, it was knowing what someone else knew. As a substantive, as a noun, it was something like a confidant or conspirator. So note the con prefix, indicating withness, being with. It then became extended into knowing something about yourself. In other words, it was realized that, for example, your present self could know what your past self knew in the same way that you know what another person knows. Right? So the duality of knowers became fuzzier by the time of Ovid, perhaps, he tells us. English seems to have first retained the Latin meaning of knowing what oneself or another knows, but by the mid-18th century, the idea of knowing what another person knows drops out of usage. Philosophy, for the most part at least, takes up Locke's definition of consciousness as the perception of what passes in a man's own mind. So the interpretation of this is that thinking is by definition conscious. That's kind of how we think of it today. The Lockean tradition collapses mind and consciousness. The meaning of the prefix con, C-O-N, with, fades away. Much could be added to this history, of course. More recent studies, such as Udo Thiel's book on the early modern subject, give a fuller picture of the history of the word. Singer simply wants to point out that giving consciousness a social, non-private meaning has historical precedent. So for Singer, consciousness is a state of mind that knows another state of mind, whether that other state of mind is your own or another person's. In Krikorian's phrasing, there's self-consciousness and other consciousness, self and other consciousness. Consciousness is becoming aware that you or someone else is having a particular kind of experience. For example, anger. You can become angry and get carried away unconsciously by it. On the other hand, you can notice that you're getting angry and channel it or try to modify it in some way. Indeed, so if you become conscious of emotion, it tends to change the emotion because thinking about your emotion distracts you from actually feeling the emotion. So anger, to get back to our example, is one cognitive, conative, or cognitive affective response to a situation. A car cuts you off in traffic, your child isn't listening to you, your coworker misses a deadline, and now your work is behind schedule. You've made a cognitive judgment about a situation, the judgment being that it interferes with your desire. your desire, it interferes with your desire for a peaceful or efficient drive in your car, your desire for your child to obey you, your desire to finish your work on time. But you're conscious of this only when you recognize that you've become angry. And then, depending on other desires, for example, a desire to appear as as a calm and rational person, you may try to change your behavior. In many cases, however, the other person will become conscious of your state of mind before you do. If you start tailgating and honking your horn at the car that cut you off, the other driver will soon become conscious of your mental state, even if you're not. Now, in this case, it's not just that the other driver becomes aware of your behavior. This would be unconscious cognition. She might very well begin to reason as to the cause of your behavior, and this means hypothesizing about the state of your mind, and this means a jump into consciousness. So this driver seems to be angry that I cut him off, or that driver's crazy. Is he upset about something? Is he trying to tell me something? What did I do? Essentially, at this point, you're trying to reason about another person's mind in order to be able to predict his behavior, and thus your own behavior. What is he going to do next? What am I going to have to do in response? Now, this definition of consciousness has a lot going for it. It's simple, logical, elegant. You might want to try it out. I'm not totally convinced about it in all respects. Perhaps it's a bit too simple. Anyway, we'll get some related but different definitions of consciousness when we get to people like B.F. Skinner, Julian Jaynes in later lectures. But anyway, framed in this way, mind, including consciousness, becomes an object that we can investigate experimentally. We can observe how different people respond in the same situation, or how one person responds in a series of situations, and get a sense of how their cognition works. We can ask people questions about their experiences and compare observations in a community of inquirers. Basically all the things psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists do. What we can't do, barring some crazy new technology, is have someone else's experiences. But, as I've emphasized, for behaviorists, being something other than you are is not a condition for knowledge of that thing. Behaviorists and empiricists predict that our knowledge of the world, our ability to make predictions about the world, will improve over time as a result of careful investigation. It's not predicted that we'll ever attain perfect knowledge of anything. So to criticize empiricists or behaviorists for not being able to demonstrate beyond a shadow of a doubt that other people have minds is to make the ideal of perfect knowledge the enemy of good knowledge. Now, related to this, I want to close with a discussion of what William James, the famous pragmatist philosopher, called the automatic sweetheart, kind of an old-fashioned term, the automatic sweetheart, or what recent philosophy of mind calls the philosophical zombie. This is not, of course, a zombie that enjoys philosophy, but an entity that looks and acts like a person, but has no inner life, no sensations, no consciousness, things like that. This is a topic Singer addresses in his Mind as an Observable Object essay. He was responding to something William James wrote in a footnote to one of his essays on the pragmatist theory of truth. So let me quote James's little thought experiment that he gives. So James says, "I thought of what I called an automatic sweetheart, meaning a soulless body which should be absolutely indistinguishable from a spiritually animated maiden, laughing, talking, blushing, nursing us, and performing all feminine offices as tactfully and sweetly as if a soul were in her. Would anyone regard her as a full equivalent of a real woman? Certainly not," he says. "And why? Because framed as we are, our egoism craves, above all things, inward sympathy and recognition and admiration, love and admiration. The outward treatment is valued mainly as an expression, as a manifestation. Pragmatically, then, the idea of the automatic sweetheart would not work. And in point of fact, no one treats it as a serious hypothesis. That's the end of his quotation. So imagine that you have a lover who treats you as you would want and is, in all outward appearances, absolutely indistinguishable from a normal woman, but who has none of the mental behaviors that we've been discussing. No sensations or raw feels, no cognition, no conation, no consciousness. Singer's response is, well, how would you know this? Let's assume that no one told you, but that you came to this notion on your own. So if any sense can be made of this situation at all, and personally I think that most versions of the automatic sweetheart or philosophical zombie problem are incoherent, but if any sense can be made of this, it's that my expectations about her behavior have now changed. Unless I'm just going crazy, just going insane, there must have been some behavioral cue on the part of my lover to suggest that she is without mind, that she really has no inward sympathy and recognition, no love and admiration for me. As Singer puts it, it is a difference between the poorer and the fuller experience of the thing. So in my earlier acquaintance with her, she seemed to be a normal person, but now something seems to be different. This can only mean that her future behavior with regard to me has become uncertain. Is she going to run off with the mailman? Is she going to kill me in my sleep? Or it could mean that my own future behavior has become uncertain. Is she the same, but I'm just getting bored with her? Am I going to run off with the mailman? Now, if no future investigation, however thorough, could reveal a difference between a soulful and a soulless lover, between a lover with a mind and one without a mind, then we seem to be using these words nonsensically. If there's no difference, then what are we talking about? As Singer puts it, it's as if you were to assure me that a given figure of given shape must prove to all possible observation to be a three-sided plane, yet might in itself somehow be without triangularity. So we have a shape that appears to all possible observation to be a triangle, yet you say it lacks some essence of triangularity. Or we have a person who appears to all possible observation to have a mind, yet you say it lacks a mind. What possible sense does this make? All right, so to conclude, for behaviorist empiricists like Singer and De Laguna and Krikorian, mind is not some immaterial substance held by certain kinds of organisms and known only to the individual organism that has it. It's a way of managing behavior that is afforded by particular kinds of nervous systems. And as a function of certain organisms, it can be investigated scientifically. As we'll see in subsequent lectures, it is something also that has an evolutionary history, and it's something that's learned. All right, so that's all for now, all for the Singerian tradition. For references, please check out the lecture notes. You can find a link down below. All right, so thank you for listening, and let me know if you have any questions or comments. Bye.